Brian, after sitting 34 years cold on a shelf, finally a Facebook page and an alert West Michigan family finally broke all of this open. Now there's even a person of interest in the case. Detectives made the announcement late this afternoon. They say DNA evidence from a family here in West Michigan was used to make that tragic match between Carol and Bossier Doe, the unidentified female remains police have been holding on to for decades.
The last person to see Carol and Cole alive described her as cheerful. That word has haunted this case for nearly 4 decades. Cheerful. Walking down a road in rural Louisiana in the summer of 1985, 17 years old, full of whatever 17-year-olds are full of: plans, daydreams, the particular restlessness of a life that hasn't quite started yet. And then she was gone. Just gone. The way people sometimes disappear from small towns, quietly enough that the world keeps turning before anyone realizes something has been torn out of it. Her body was found not long after. The evidence collected at the scene was careful, deliberate, the kind of physical evidence that investigators in 1985 knew was important even if they couldn't fully explain why. They bagged it. They labeled it. They stored it. And then the case went cold. Not because nobody cared, but because the technology to unlock what that evidence was trying to say simply did not exist yet. The DNA was sitting right there, waiting, like a letter written in a language no one had learned to read. And the man who killed Carol and Cole kept living his life for 37 years, while she got none of hers. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We have viewers from all over the world joining these stories, and it means everything to know you're here. To understand why this case matters, not just as a crime, but as a symbol, you have to understand Louisiana in 1985. Specifically, you have to understand what it felt like to live in the rural parishes that sit between Baton Rouge and the Texas border, where the land is flat and green and impossibly humid, where the air in summer sits on your skin like a warm, wet cloth and doesn't move. The roads out there stretch long and straight through pine forest and crawfish fields, and the towns along them are the kind of towns where everybody knows your business and strangers are noticed. Carol and Cole was not a stranger. She was a local girl, 17, with the kind of face that shows up in school photographs with a slight, uncertain smile. The smile of someone who is still figuring out what she wants the world to see. People who knew her described her as quiet in the way that thoughtful people are quiet, not withdrawn, just interior. She had a life ahead of her. That phrase gets used so often in cases like this that it has almost lost its meaning, but stop and hold it for a moment. A life ahead of her. Not a finished life. A beginning. And someone took that beginning and ended it violently on the side of a road in the summer heat of a Louisiana afternoon. The exact circumstances of how Carol and came to be on that road on that particular day have been reconstructed over the years from witness accounts and investigative records. What is clear is that she was seen walking. She was alive, and she was moving, and she was heading somewhere, the way young people walk when they have somewhere to be. And then she encountered someone. We do not know what was said. We do not know if there was a moment where she sensed something wrong. What we know is the outcome. And the outcome was that a 17-year-old girl was murdered and left, and the man who did it drove away. When investigators arrived at the scene, they understood immediately that they were looking at a homicide. The physical evidence was processed with the tools available in 1985, which were considerable. Fingerprinting, trace analysis, the collection of biological material that would later be recognized as a DNA profile waiting to be extracted. But in 1985, DNA profiling was barely a concept. The technique had only just been developed in a laboratory in the United Kingdom by a geneticist named Alec Jeffreys, and it would be another year before it was used in an actual criminal case anywhere in the world. Louisiana investigators had done everything right. They just didn't know yet what right would eventually make possible. The case was investigated. Leads were followed. People were interviewed. And then, one by one, the leads dried up. The case didn't close. Cases like this don't close, not officially, not in the hearts of the detectives who work them. But it stalled. It became one of those files that sits in a cabinet that gets pulled out periodically when a new detective inherits it or when someone calls in a tip, and then gets put back when the tip leads nowhere. For years. For decades. Here is a thing that does not get discussed enough about cold cases. The people who work them are not working them in a vacuum. A cold case detective carries a full caseload of current investigations. Active crimes, fresh scenes, living victims who need immediate attention. The cold cases get worked in the margins, in the early mornings and the late evenings, on days off and lunch breaks. The detectives who pursue them do so because they cannot let them go, not because the system has given them unlimited resources and time. This is important to understand because it means that every breakthrough in a cold case represents not just scientific progress, but human persistence. Someone chose, over and over again, to keep choosing this case when they could have stopped. For Carol and Cole, that persistence lived in the Louisiana State Police and in the local investigators who never filed this case away in any meaningful sense. Her name stayed in the system. Her evidence stayed preserved. And as the years turned into decades, something was quietly changing in the world of forensic science that would eventually bring her case roaring back to life. The year 2001 is when the first tremor happened, though almost nobody noticed it at the time. A company called Parabon Nanolabs, based out of Virginia, began working on something called DNA phenotyping, the ability to look at genetic material and predict what a person looked like. Not perfectly, not like a photograph, but enough to produce a composite image of a suspect's likely face shape, eye color, hair color, skin tone, and even freckle pattern, all derived purely from the genetic code left behind at a crime scene. It sounds like science fiction. It is, in fact, science. And it was about to change cold case investigation in ways that nobody had fully anticipated. Then came genetic genealogy. This is where the story accelerates, and where you need to pay close attention, because understanding this technique is the key to understanding how a killer who thought he had escaped justice for nearly 4 decades was finally found. Genetic genealogy begins with the DNA from the crime scene. In Carol and Cole's case, investigators had biological material collected in 1985 that had been preserved for exactly this moment. Modern laboratory techniques, far more sophisticated than anything available in the 80s, were able to extract a full genetic profile from that material. A profile precise enough to do something extraordinary. That profile was then uploaded to a public genealogy database. The largest of these is GeneMatch, a platform where ordinary people voluntarily upload their own DNA results from consumer testing services like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe in order to find biological relatives. When investigators upload an unknown profile to this database, the system searches for partial matches, segments of DNA that overlap with segments in the database. These partial matches are not the suspect. They are the suspect's relatives. Cousins. Second cousins. People who share a common ancestor with the unknown individual and who, by uploading their own DNA, have inadvertently provided a thread that trained genealogists can follow. This is where the human expertise comes in. Genetic genealogy is not a machine that spits out a name. It is a discipline practiced by investigators who have trained in both genetics and traditional genealogical research. They take those partial matches and they begin building family trees. They research birth records, marriage certificates, census data, obituaries, social media profiles, local newspaper archives. They go back generations, identifying common ancestors, then working forward again, branch by branch, try to narrow down the pool of potential suspects until they arrive at a small group of individuals, or ideally one individual, who fits the genetic profile, the geography, and the timeline. It is slow. It is painstaking. It requires patience of a particular, almost meditative quality. And when it works, it is devastating to anyone who thought they had gotten away. The Louisiana State Police partnered with investigators and genetic genealogy experts to begin applying this methodology to Carol and Cole's case. The work was not accomplished overnight. Reconstructing a family tree from partial DNA matches, especially in rural Louisiana, where family connections can be dense and tangled across generations, is the kind of work that takes months. You identify a match who shares, say, 1% of their DNA with the unknown profile. That suggests a relationship in the range of third cousins. You build their family tree backward until you find the common ancestor. Then you build it forward again through all the branches, all the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, looking for the branch that would have produced a male of the right age who lived in the right area in 1985. Every time a branch dead-ended, investigators moved to the next one. Every time a promising candidate turned out to have an alibi, or to have been living in another state, or to have died before the crime was committed, the work continued. This is the part of the story that rarely gets enough attention. The quiet hours of failure that preceded the breakthrough. The dead ends. The names that looked right and weren't. The frustration of being close and not close enough. And then, slowly, the tree began to point in one direction. The genealogical research produced a family. A Louisiana family with roots in the region. A family tree that, when built forward and narrowed down by age and gender and geography, produced a candidate. A male. Someone who would have been alive in 1985. Someone who would have been old enough and who had been in the right place. Before investigators could act on any of this, they needed confirmation. Genetic genealogy, by itself, does not constitute legal proof. It is an investigative tool, extraordinarily powerful, but it points in a direction rather than closing a case. What investigators needed was a direct DNA comparison. They needed to get a sample from their suspect and compare it to the DNA from the 1985 crime scene. There's a technique for this. When investigators identify a suspect through genetic genealogy but cannot yet compel them to provide a DNA sample, they conduct what is called a trash pull or a similar covert collection. They retrieve discarded material, a cup from a restaurant, a cigarette, butt, an item placed in a garbage can, anything that contains cellular material and has been voluntarily abandoned by the individual. This material is then analyzed in a laboratory, and the resulting profile is compared to the unknown profile from the crime scene. This is the moment. This is the fulcrum on which everything turns. Because either the profiles match, and a 37-year-old mystery collapses into a name, an address, a man going about his daily life who is about to have that life interrupted by a knock on the door, or they do not match, and investigators go back to the tree. In the case of Carol and Cole, the profiles matched. The name as Jerry Harthen. He had been living in Louisiana. He had built a life in the years since 1985, the kind of ordinary, unremarkable life that provides excellent camouflage for someone with something to hide. He was not a figure of obvious menace. He was not someone who had continued to attract attention from law enforcement, not someone whose name had come up repeatedly in the decades of investigation into Carolyn's death. He had simply kept living, while she had not. When investigators compared the DNA from the crime scene to the sample collected from Harthen, the match was definitive. Not probable, not suggestive, definitive. The genetic material left at the scene of Carol and Cole's murder, collected and preserved in 1985, belonged to Jerry Harthen. After 37 years, the evidence that had been waiting in storage finally had a name to attach itself to. The arrest came in 2022. Think about that for a moment. 2022, Carol and Cole would have been 54 years old. She would have lived through the fall of the Berlin Wall, through the internet becoming a thing, through cell phones and streaming services and a global pandemic. She would have seen things change in ways that nobody in 1985 could have predicted. She never got any of it. And the man who took all of that from her had gotten every one of those years and must have thought at some point that he was beyond reach. He was not beyond reach. He was never beyond reach. The evidence just needed time to catch up with the science. Har then was charged with the first-degree murder of Carol and Cole. The case that prosecutors built was anchored in the DNA evidence, the direct genetic link between the biological material from the 1985 crime scene and the sample obtained from Har then in 2022. This is the kind of evidence that does not age, does not become unreliable, does not change its story depending on who is asking the questions. DNA either matches or does not. In this case, it matched. Perfectly. Conclusively. The legal proceedings moved forward with a weight of nearly 4 decades, pressing down on every motion, every hearing, every procedural step. Carol Lynn's family, the people who had lived with this loss since 1985, who had gone through all those years without an answer, without a name, without the particular kind of closure that comes not from forgetting, but from knowing, finally had something solid to hold on to. A name, a face, a man in a courtroom. In 2022, Jerry Har then was convicted of the murder of Carol and Cole. He was sentenced to life in prison. There is no sentence that gives back what was taken. No verdict restores a 17-year-old girl to the road she was walking in the summer of 1985. The law does not work in reversals. What it can do, what it did here, is establish accountability. It can say on the record, in a courtroom, with evidence and witnesses and the full weight of the justice system behind it. This happened, this person did it, and there will be consequences. For Carol Lynn's family, after 37 years, that accountability is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything that was still possible to give them. This CSE is not just a story about one girl and one killer. It is a story about a system, and what happens when that system fails and then, decades later, finds the tools to correct itself. And from that story, there are things worth carrying with you. The first lesson is about evidence preservation. In 1985, the investigators who collected biological material from the scene of Carol and Cole's murder could not have known that 37 years later that material would be the key to solving the case. They preserved it anyway, because that is what careful professional investigators do. They understood that evidence has value beyond the immediate moment, that the future might know things the present does not. This principle applies broadly. In any situation where physical evidence might matter, in any legal context, any dispute, any circumstance where the truth of what happened might one day be questioned, preserve everything. Label it. Store it carefully. Do not assume that if it doesn't matter now, it will never matter. The investigators in this case are the reason justice was possible, because they did their job completely in a moment when they had no way of knowing how much it would eventually count. The second lesson is about the power of voluntary DNA databases and the complicated ethics that surround them. The genetic genealogy technique that identified Jerry Har then worked because ordinary people with no connection to Carol and Cole, people simply interested in finding their biological relatives or learning about their ancestry, had voluntarily uploaded their DNA to public databases. By doing so, they inadvertently became part of an investigative network that extends to everyone genetically connected to them, including people they have never met. This is worth thinking about carefully. If you have uploaded your DNA to a consumer testing service, your genetic profile does not exist in isolation. It exists in relation to everyone who shares your ancestry, including anyone in your family tree who may have committed a crime. This is not an argument against uploading your DNA. For many people, the benefits are significant and real. But it is an argument for making that decision with full awareness of what it means. Your DNA is not just yours. It is a thread in a web that connects you to people you do not know, and investigators know how to follow threads. The third lesson is about the nature of cold cases and what this case teaches us about the people who work them. Carol and Cole's case was not solved by a machine. It was not solved by an algorithm that woke up one morning and connected the dots. It was solved by investigators who kept this file alive for nearly 4 decades, by forensic scientists who extracted viable DNA from evidence that was 37 years old, by genealogists who spent months building and pruning family trees, by detectives who conducted the careful, unglamorous work of narrowing a suspect pool down to one name and then confirming that name with science. The technology was the tool. The humans were the engine. Cold case investigation is a discipline that requires not just expertise, but commitment. A refusal to accept that time is the same thing as defeat. The lesson here is that persistence is not naive. In the right hands, with the right tools, persistence wins. It won for Carol and Cole. It wins in case after case, year after year, as the science continues to advance and the evidence continues to wait. Carol and Cole was 17 years old in the summer of 1985. She was walking down a road in Louisiana, and the day was probably hot, the air thick with the particular humid weight of a southern afternoon, the kind of day where the pine trees stand very still and the light comes down flat and golden through the branches. She had her whole life ahead of her. She had plans she never got to execute, relationships she never got to develop, a version of herself at 54 that nobody ever got to meet. The man who took all of that from her thought he had escaped the consequences. For 37 years, he was right. And then the science caught up, and the investigators caught up, and the evidence that had been sitting in storage since 1985 finally said what it had always been trying to say. Justice, in cases like this, arrives late. It arrives imperfectly. It does not undo what was done. But it arrives, and after 37 years, for Carol and Cole, and for her family, it arrived. Her name deserves to be spoken. Her story deserves to be told. And the people who refuse to stop working her case, who refuse to let her become just a file in a cabinet, deserve to be recognized. Remember her name, Carol and Cole, 17 years old. Remembered. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that cases like Carol and deserve to be seen and remembered and told, subscribe to this channel. Every subscription tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling matters. Every share puts a name in front of someone who might never have heard otherwise. That is not nothing. That is, in its own small way, part of how we honor the people these stories are about. Hit the subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And we will see you in the next one.